y'all, it's Becky here from the Beckosphere, where we talk about climate news and solutions. You've entered a climate recap where we look at what is being done to reduce the impacts of and prepare for climate change. If you would like to stay up to date with the latest climate information, please consider hitting the subscribe button below and ringing the bell so that you are notified every single time I post. I do these climate recaps about every 2 weeks. This time we will look at the climate news from March 1st to 15th, so the first half of March. Let's start with examples of climate changing. Tasmania recorded the driest summer in 40 years due to the climate-strained La Nina, making rainfall practically impossible in the region. Rainfall has been about 43% below average. Meanwhile, through these 2 weeks, Australia, specifically New South Wales and Queensland, has struggled through historical floodings. Farmers there warn that 2 extreme weather events in a row, like a bushfire and now deadly floods, puts the continent's food supply at risk. Tack onto that a pandemic and now a war that's hurting the world's breadbasket. Russia and Ukraine provide almost 30% of the world's wheat exports, almost 20% of the world's corn exports, and almost 80% of the world's sunflower oil exports. Yowza. Kenya farmers are also struggling from climate-induced drought and now the wheat supply from this war. So they're also struggling over there too. 75% of the US Pacific Northwest is experiencing some level of drought. California had its driest January and February in history. And then in Florida, the Panhandle fire caused thousands of homes to evacuate on March 8th and only recently became fully contained. It was fueled by Hurricane Michael debris. A new map came out recently that looks at how biodiversity is impacted in the US. It doesn't look very good, especially in California. There's only 13% of the country that's permanently a protected space. Biden's goal to protect 30% of federal lands and waters by 2030 is a good goal, but we have a long way to go. Biodiversity is the net holding the global system in balance enough to sustain humans. Simply put, if it falls, we fall. Speaking of biodiversity, scientists at the University of Miami think that they have found a new Caribbean staghorn coral species that might be able to be conditioned to tolerate warmer waters. All tropical coral reefs are being threatened by climate change. This matters because coral reefs are biodiversity hubs that protect coastlines from storms and erosion, sustain many fishing industries, and even provide ingredients for medicine. So this is good news that there might be a few coral species that will be able to survive the next 30 years. Onto the land though, scientists are seeing 75% of the Amazon rainforest is losing its ability to bounce back from extreme weather events like wildfires. The Amazon is an essential ecosystem for maintaining Earth's water cycle and for sucking up carbon from the atmosphere. The Amazon is destabilizing due to mass deforestation, particularly in Brazil, for agricultural operations like cattle ranching and palm oil farms. So literally the cheeseburger and fries, if you will. Another recent study, this one published in the journal Nature Sustainability, found that deforestation is emitting more greenhouse gases than previously thought. Carbon loss from deforestation has doubled in the last 2 decades and continues to rise. Since 2000, we have lost 10% of the world's tree cover, making deforestation the second largest emitter for humans after fossil fuels. The Amazon has a century's worth of carbon emissions living inside. Now, last November at COP26, countries representing 90% of the world's forests agreed to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030, which is great, except that they're not really following through. Brazil hit a new deforestation record in January and February. Last depressing study for you for now. Northern Europe and Siberia is becoming too warm and wet to sustain their permafrost peatlands and will lose 75% of them even in moderate warming scenarios by the 2060s. Permafrost peatland holds as much carbon as all of the forests in Europe combined, so this would be very bad. Okay, let's get on to some climate victories, starting off with the international stuff. I'm US based as a reminder. Welcome to all the new people, by the way. The EU has told its 26 member states to use money from taxing energy firms and polluters to pay for clean energy and electrification to get themselves off Russian oil. 40% of EU's gas comes from Russia, and it seems like this war has woken up some countries to understand how intertwined Russia is with the fossil fuel industry. The plan is called Repower EU, and officials claim that they can get the EU 2/3 of the way off Russia oil by this year. Germany passed the Renewable Energy Act to get its energy sector to 100% clean energy by 2035. That means doubling onshore wind capacity and quadrupling offshore wind and solar capacity. To make this transition smoother, the government will legally oblige power suppliers to reduce consumer bills after the levy on the power price is scrapped in July 2022. Germany is also to spend $220 billion by 2026 in the form of industrial transformation. We're talking EV charging, hydrogen technology, and climate protections. On March 12th, tens of thousands of people took part in a climate protest across France. Their presidential election is next month, but the climate crisis took up only 1.5% of talking points in media coverage of the election campaign from February 28th to March 6th. What's up with that? So 40,000 to 80,000 people protested depending on who you ask. And 4 days later, the French government ended subsidies for gas heaters and boosted support for heat pumps. Countries are starting to invest in heat pumps, which help along the electrification process, getting them away from Russia, oil, and gas, and saving households around £100 a year off their energy bill. If you add rooftop solar to the mix, then that would save them about £500 per year. France wants to end its dependency on Russian oil and gas by 2027. But if they go by the EU standard of 2/3 by the end of this year, that could go a lot faster. Let's take a break from Europe for a sec and go over to Mumbai, which just became the first South Asian city to create a detailed net zero roadmap. Home to 19 million residents, Mumbai is the home of South Asia's biggest corporations, the stock market, and the central bank. It's the richest city in India. Their goal is to get to net zero by 2050, which is 20 years earlier than India's national goal, and their plan is to totally overhaul their energy, water, air, waste, transit, and even green spaces. That sounds like they have the right idea. Over to the US, the Environmental Protection Agency proposed an extension for the plan to cut ozone depleting chemicals, nitrogen oxides, for 26 states, mainly east and middle states, though also Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, and California. Their goal is to reduce this smog maker by 26% by 2026. Part of that means new stringent limits on pollution for buses, delivery vans, tractor trailers, and other heavy trucks. California instead is allowed to set its own emission standards again because it's been ahead of the country on emission standards since the Clean Air Act was created. But recently, during the Trump administration, their authority was taken away, so now their authority is back. Sorry, by the way, that my California video has not come up again. I know I said I would get it up last Monday, but some scheduling issues came up, and so now I'm shooting for this Friday. Thank you for your patience, but look forward to a very researched video. It's going to be probably pretty long, so make sure you have a nice beverage when you watch it. The compliant cost for making this switch would be about $1.9 billion compared to the human benefit of $9.3 billion. So it seems pretty worth it. Though some people wish that the administration would have imposed EV truck mandate. But this still is a good move, so let's hope that this new EPA proposal doesn't get challenged in the courts too hard. 22 states have come out saying that they do support the new EU plan. I feel like the EU is trying to make as many moves as it can before it loses its power potentially in the Supreme Court ruling, West Virginia versus the EPA, which has been trying to strip the EPA's authority to regulate chemicals to maintain the nation's clean air, which is a very big problem. The first half of March wasn't the best for Chevron. First, Earth Client announced that it was representing activist shareholders who want to block the re-election of its chairman and chief executive, citing his failure to cut emissions. So that's going on. Then Texas charged the company $120 million and required the company to upgrade its infrastructure as necessary to reduce flaring activities. Flaring is when oil companies burn off natural gas instead of capturing it during the drilling process. So it's just wasted energy with potent greenhouse gas emissions. And less than a week ago, a Chevron oil tanker was spotted getting more oil from Russia, even though it promised to cease operations there in solidarity with Ukraine. So that's just scummy, and I hope that they get dinged for it. They are not the only oil company to be caught doing this, and the Ukraine has called on the US to issue tougher sanctions. This seems like as good a segue as ever to start talking about climate change fails, starting with more international fossil fuel shenanigans. Oh, and please wait till the end for my favorite climate victory point. It's kind of a fun one. The offshore wind company Ørsted is accusing the fossil fuel company BP of trying to block part of the UK's offshore wind farm off of Yorkshire coast. Both of these companies have secured rights to build offshore wind there, but BP is trying to block Ørsted from building on the part where they share authority because BP wants to store carbon under the sea floor. Now, the idea of storing carbon under the seafloor is complex, and I'm sure there's plenty of opinions on it, though I haven't looked too far into that on its own. But the new report by the UK think tank Energy Transition Commission does argue that carbon capture and carbon offset markets will be needed at this point to limit the warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. BP isn't wrong for wanting to include carbon storage in their design, though I do worry about the storage process's impact on the marine ecosystem. The main problem is that the plan would render a quarter of the space dedicated to offshore wind farms useless, removing 675 megawatts of clean energy. It could also hurt Ørsted's ability to win a government auction to sell the energy at a fixed price, which is crucial for the wind farm's viability. So it's not a good move for them to be doing this, basically, if we're going to encourage the offshore wind. Let's go now to another emissions-heavy industry, agribusiness. 5 of the biggest agribusiness firms, that's ADM, Bunge, Cargill, LDC, and Viterra, tried to thwart EU efforts to reduce deforestation, which has been linked to food products such as palm oil, cocoa, beef, coffee, and soy. The EU started these efforts after signing a pledge to end deforestation by 2050 during COP26, the International Climate Conference in November 2021. The agriculture industry is responsible for 1/4 of global carbon emissions, and a large amount of this is due to deforestation, particularly in the Amazon rainforest. These 5 firms have argued that attempting to reduce deforestation will result in food shortages and soaring prices. Wait, so they're really saying that we have 2 options, either to deforest the Amazon or go hungry? That's a pretty scary world to live in if they think these are the only 2 options. Also, in destroying the Amazon, agribusinesses are actually making the region less hospitable for the crops and cows. A new study found that the area is getting drier and hotter. And let's not forget what I said earlier about what deforestation is doing to the planet at large. So bottom line, this is a very short-lived self-serving goal that they are going through right now. To look at the bigger picture for a sec, a new analysis published in the journal Nature found that G20 nations only spent 6% of their COVID recovery funds on building back greener. Additionally, 3% of the COVID funds was spent on carbon-intensive activities and industries, like coal subsidies. An example of a G20 country spending stuff on coal is India. India pledged to be carbon neutral by 2070 during COP26 in November, but India then never submitted any emissions targets to actually follow through with this pledge. Instead, it expects private coal mines to produce at least 350 million tons of coal by 2030. What are they doing? That is the wrong direction. So let's talk about the Ukrainian crisis now for a bit and fossil fuels again. Ukraine's leading climate scientist said that this is a fossil fuel war, saying, quote, burning oil, gas, and coal is causing warming and impacts we need to adapt to. And Russia sells these resources and uses the money to buy weapons. Other countries are dependent upon this fossil fuel war. It's clear that we cannot continue to live this way without destroying our civilization. Honestly, the biggest thing that Svetlana Krakowska thought that she would be doing the week that Russia invaded was releasing the IPCC report, which she was one of the authors of for the last 8 years. She and her 4 children are still in Kyiv, and my thoughts go out to them. I will leave some links in the description box below if you would like to make a donation to Ukrainians to help. 5 oil execs recently cashed out on $99 million in stocks since late February, according to a new analysis conducted by nonprofits Bailout Watch and Friends of the Earth. We're talking about the CEO of Hess Corporations, the CEO and director of Pioneer Natural Resources, the CEO of Marathon Oil, and the president of Continental Resources cashing out on a war. Now, the US has banned Russian oil imports, but as I talked about with Chevron earlier, not all companies are actually done making money off of this tragedy. US-based fossil fuel companies immediately started using the war as a marketing tool to argue for more permits and fewer regulations, even though they aren't even using all the permits that they already have. You can learn more about this in Climate Town's latest video, so I will leave that up in the cards. Something sneaky that I noticed that fossil fuel companies have been doing is they've been advertising themselves as the energy industry. So when they don't like something, they will start saying, this is against the energy industry, even though most of the time it's good for the rest of the energy industry. When the war started, the American Petroleum Institute, which represents a lot of fossil fuel companies, tweeted, unleash the energy industry. Don't do that. No. Do not unleash the fossil fuel industry, because they are already plenty unleashed. Global carbon emissions reached their highest level in history in 2021, and that was predominantly due to China's increase in coal use. So we literally can't afford like India to do the same or for us to unleash more. All right, let's take a sec to enjoy my favorite climate victory point. OkCupid came out with a survey recently that found that caring about the environment is a big deal for people. 90% of the 250,000 people surveyed over the past year said that it was important to care about. 81% of the 6 million people surveyed in the last 3 years said that it was important to care about. I love that. Women were 7% more likely than men to care about the environment. Okay, so we got through some of the main news points that I wanted to dive into. Now let's go and look at the other news points that took place on the first half of March. For other climate change studies, wildfires may slow the recovery of the ozone layer. A study showed the Australian bushfires did just that. The expanding and more destructive wildfire season is harming firefighters' mental health. A small study among Canadian firefighters found that 87% of them came away from the last bad wildfire season with mental health issues. There hasn't been enough research done on this issue though to know how many firefighters have taken their lives. Just a growing amount of analogies to imply that there is definitely a rise in this rate. 40% of the world's insect population is declining, and a third of insects are considered endangered. Again, biodiversity is our safety net. Without insects, our food system collapses. The combination of climate change and plastic chemicals is hindering fish growth. Researchers say that we need to find new wheat varieties to withstand global warming. Researchers say that if China can peak emissions by 2025 instead of 2030, then they can save hundreds of thousands of lives. Global cyclone activity between 1990 and 2021 has not increased, but has gotten more damaging. Hurricanes in North Carolina have been linked to an increase in gastrointestinal illnesses in particularly marginalized communities. Scientists warn that seawalls could make rising seas worse in the long run, and a third of hazardous chemical facilities in the US are threatened by climate change-induced sea level rise and extreme weather events. Last thing we need is more chemical spills. Okay, let's move on to some other climate victories. or action points, like this first one. A study laid out the 6 key lifestyle changes a person can make to help avert the climate crisis. They became part of a JUMP campaign, which people can commit to for 1, 3, or 6 months to work on these goals, which is a little funny because a lot of these have to do multi-year goals, but they are eating a plant-based diet, buying no more than 3 articles of clothing a year, keeping electrical products for at least 7 years, taking no more than 1 short-haul flight every 3 years and 1 long-haul flight every 8 years, getting rid of personal motor vehicles or keeping a vehicle for as long as you can, and making at least 1 other life shift to nudge the system, like moving towards clean energy, insulating your home, or changing your pension provider. All of these are really good steps. I hope that the flights are round trip and not single trip, and I will say that I'm going to try to do these more, though I have my own personal caveats. I haven't really gone into on this channel what I personally do to make an environmental impact, because I'm trying to reduce the amount of individual responsibility on people, but if you want me to go more into what I personally do to reduce my environmental impact, let me know in the comments below and maybe I'll consider making a video for that. Anyways, Brazil's beef industry is claiming to start tackling methane emissions using fermentation and other more sustainable agriculture practices to help store carbon in the soil. They're also trying to feed cattle different things to help reduce their emissions through farting and burping. Red Cross International has officially started calling climate change a national security concern. In France, several environmental groups have come together to sue Total Energies for tricking consumers into thinking that they were cleaner than they were. Basically, they were greenwashing themselves. In the UK, Shell's board of 13 directors is being sued by a group of activist shareholders for failing to prepare for the company's net zero future. The shareholders are being represented by Earth Client, which was also in a previous lawsuit that I mentioned, who has a good track record for winning cases, and they are trying to argue that Shell's directors are breaching the duties under the UK's Company Act by not following through with the Paris Climate Accord agreements. Climate Action 100 Plus, the world's largest group of investors pushing companies to reduce emissions faster, are urging airlines to curtail growth and use sustainable fuel. The Global Standard on Responsible Climate Lobbying is urging companies to lobby for climate issues. London is expanding its ultra-low emission zone to city limits. So instead of just being the main part of the city, it's the whole city. World nations are considering a global pact to ramp up protections for nature, and environmental groups want rich nations to pay $60 billion a year to protect developing countries' nature. The pact is currently considering $10 billion a year. The Arctic Council, which manages operations in the Arctic as it warms, kicked out Russia amid the Ukrainian invasion. The Umbrella Group, a negotiating bloc of non-EU developed countries on climate change, also removed Russia and Belarus from the group. The newly elected Honduras government banned open pit mining. Colombia launched an offshore wind plan with its first project. The Saudi Energy Ministry awarded 2 renewable energy projects with a total capacity of 1,000 megawatts. And Northern Ireland finally committed to net zero emissions by 2050. Over in the US, the Biden administration announced it won't appeal the judge's ruling, which revoked all of the Gulf of Mexico drilling leases made last summer. Electric vehicle sales in the US skyrocketed last year. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, launched its latest weather and fire tracking satellite into orbit. The American Psychological Association released an action plan for psychologists on how to best address the climate crisis. Peabody, America's biggest coal producer, is putting solar panels and battery storage on retired coal mines in Indiana and Illinois. Colorado will require fossil fuel companies to provide more bonds to ensure there is enough money to clean up wells and their overall projects. The first net zero development is coming to Rockaway and Queens, part of New York City, after Hurricane Sandy demolished the area. The designers promise affordable housing. The mayor of Boston, Michelle Wu, is embarking on an ambitious food policy agenda. Oregon's largest solar energy facility yet gains final approval. U.S. farmers are improving their practices to be more sustainable, but there's still definitely room for improvement. This increasingly obnoxious headline means a varied spending package approved some money for water projects. Side note, but headlines like these do not inspire engagement. Please do not throw the dictionary at people. Like we're seeing in Europe, the idea of heat pumps reducing reliance on Russian fossil fuels is being floated around the US too. Indiana barred Duke Energy, the largest energy supplier in the US, from pushing off coal ash cleanup payments onto customers, and Amazon is working to use more clean construction methods. Now on to other climate fails, starting internationally. The IPCC report warns that half-assing climate responses are becoming more common and wasting money and time, and sometimes resulting in more emissions and problems. Electric vehicles can't hold a charge as well in the winter, so that is a design flaw that we need to figure out, though Tesla seems to be better at holding charge during the winter than other models. The EU missed its wind capacity installation target by more than 50% in 2021. The UK is missing the $67 billion mark needed for the clean energy shift. The UK's plan to offset emissions through tree planting has failed due to lack of incentives and funding. Boris Johnson suggested the UK should relax green targets due to the war. Climate advisors found multiple risks of failure in the UK's Green Home Plan. And a new Scottish climate change report rebukes ministers for stalling on climate action. Whew, okay, the UK's not looking so hot right now. Over in Canada, the country's oil and gas emissions cap may be delayed until 2023, leaving a hole in their climate plans. 5 timber companies are in charge of the fate of BC's old growth forests. Older trees absorb more carbon better than younger trees and are the backbone of forest ecosystems, and they're also more fire resistant. So there's 3 reasons why they should not cut down old growth forests. And Australia's environmental minister, Susan Ley, successfully appealed a previous ruling stating that she has a duty to protect the environment for future generations. So I guess the environmental minister doesn't have a responsibility to reduce impact on environment for future generations? What is her job again? What's the purpose then? Now to the US. US ethanol subsidies might be another way that we are indirectly supporting Russia. US-backed companies are poised to expand mining in the Amazon. Amazon, the company, is allegedly drastically undercounting its greenhouse gas emissions. The US beef industry is still not being asked to do much to reduce emissions. Redlining, a racist Depression-era method where lenders considered areas with higher percentage of colored people higher risk for real estate investment, has unsurprisingly contributed to unequal air pollution across America, a big environmental justice problem. A gas leak at the ConocoPhillips Alaska drilling site forces some people to leave for the sake of their health. Kentucky joins a growing list of states that want to boycott companies that want to boycott fossil fuels. Florida lawmakers voted to phase out subsidies for rooftop solar. The Minnesota Senate introduced a bill that would block clean car standards. The US government only approved $1 billion in climate finance for developing countries several years after developing countries promised to provide $100 billion for developing countries every year. The US's tsunami warning system needs a lot of upgrades. And West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin blocked Sarah Bloom Raskin's nomination for a top Federal Reserve position because he didn't like that she supported clean energy. Biden officially removed the nomination after the fact. Okay, finally onto fossil fuel fails, which honestly is starting to become chemical fails, but a lot of these chemicals either rely on fossil fuels or are in the environment because of fossil fuel companies. So I think I'm keeping the name. The UK overruled scientific advice by lifting a ban on bee-harming pesticides. Similarly, the US EPA is planning to allow the use of 4 insect-paralyzing pesticides for another 15 years. US officials also reversed course on banning a pesticide that harms wildlife after chemical companies said that they will put better labels on their products instead. Meanwhile, LA is suing 3 companies over toxic PCBs in waterways. U.S. Steel was fined $1.8 million for hydrogen sulfide emissions at their Clairton plant. A new study found that higher levels of PFAS, forever chemicals found in plastics, may increase people's chances of catching COVID. The Department of Defense is investigating U.S. sites for PFAS contamination, but at the same time, the Air Force is considering blowing up toxic waste, which includes PFAS, on a beach in Guam. So that's a little inconsistent. And half of Americans were exposed to lead as children, lowering IQ by 2 points on average. One of the main exposure points was leaded gasoline. And that was the climate recap from March 1st to 15th. Please let me know in the comment section which news points you found the most interesting. I think the OkCupid thing is hilarious, and it gives me hope. Until next time, remember to talk about the climate crisis every single day and to support your local news organizations. Thank you to the people on Patreon who help me pay for my equipment and the many news subscriptions that make these climate recaps possible. A special shout out to the climate confident and courageous members, David H., Norman Anal, Greg H., Paul B., and now Phil Plasma. Hi, Phil. I greatly appreciate all of you, and if you would like to monetarily support the work I do, please check out the Patreon or buy me a coffee, link in the description box below. Patreon is monthly, buy me a cup of coffee is one at a time, but if you give me a buy a cup of coffee donation, I'll give you a little shout out. All right, thank you so much for watching. I'll see y'all next time. Bye.